These are stories that are told on March 11th, 2002. Ken Watkins Sr., Marilyn Watkins Stevens, Ralph Stevens, Shirley Watkins Willis, and Marilly Watkins Comer.
No rush.
Well, I think when I finish this, we've got to hear Kenny's version of his engagement, okay?
Sounds fair.
I sure have had lots of happy memories.
Oh, I'm thankful for that. Well, you have to remember that we lived in apartments where it was all set by being single. You got points for being married, you got points for children and all. So singles were at the bottom of the heap. So I was in one of these concrete block apartments where I could see out my window when this tall young man was coming up the street. For a few months before this, I used to run out and empty the garbage or go out and shake my rugs or something, thinking he might stop and strike up a conversation. But he didn't. And it turned out we actually had been swimming at the swimming pool together, but since both of us took off our glasses and we were both very nearsighted, we didn't know that. So one Sunday night, there was a lady a young woman who'd always played the piano for the two hymns that we sang when we had our every other Sunday night devotional service. And she had left town, and nobody else could play, and I was as bad as anybody, but I was willing to go and practice for about an hour so I could get through two hymns. So I found Al Bacon up in that restaurant, and as I recall, he was sitting at the same table with Ralph. And whether that persuaded Ralph to come that night, I don't know. Did it?
I think it had something to do with it.
So he saw me get the key to the church, and I went and practiced, and then when I did see him coming in that night, I made a few mistakes on the piano. Anyway, we had a nice little service, and then we went to one of the fellows' apartments and had dessert and coffee, I think. And we were all sitting around, and Ralph came over and sat by me, and we had a nice talk. And another girl was in on that. And eventually it was time to go home, and he said he'd walk us home. And I remember thinking, take her first. And indeed, we walked to her place first, and then he came to mine, and I said, do you want to come in? And he said, yes. So we talked some more. And I really liked everything he said. So then that was Sunday night, and I thought he'll probably call Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but nothing happened. And I thought, I thought we'd kind of hit it off. But Friday night he called, and I think it was a little later, maybe 8 or 9 by this time. And he said, would I like to come over and listen to records? And yes, I would. So I went over, and we really had and I, of course, found out that he liked classical music and some more serious conversation. And so that night we made a plan that the next day he'd come over and have lunch after his class. It turns out he had classes Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday morning. So that's where he was all that time. And then we'd play tennis.
You should have known then that I had another love.
Was it field theory number 1 and Marilyn number 2? So we never did play tennis, but he ate blueberry pancakes, and then we sat and talked, and pretty soon the talk got serious, and pretty soon he wondered if I would marry him. And I said yes. Now, it did get a little serious. I said later, isn't this right, Ralph? I shouldn't have said yes without asking, would Christ be the center of our lives? And he said, well, that isn't the way it had been, but that's the way he wanted it to be. So we talked about children and a number of things. And then...
You're not going to talk the rest of
Yes, yes, yes. Tell.
Well, he looked at his watch and he said, I guess I better be going. I have a date tonight. And I swallowed that. I thought, well, that means he doesn't just impulsively, well, yes, he did impulsively ask me to marry him, but he stood by his commitments. And so, now here's the deal.
I
When,
had been invited out.
That's
Okay.
good to know.
That's a little different, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there was food involved, too.
That's a big difference.
That's a big difference.
And the next night, Judy had asked if I would like to come. They had a number of friends who got together and they'd just all take a part and read plays. And Ralph said he'd like to go along with that, so Judy was the first one to know. And she approved, I think. So then, I went to work the next morning and often had taken my lunch, but this time went to the cafeteria, and there were some friends, and one of them, good friends of Gursky's, as I made my way over to that table, he said, well, Marilyn, we hear some very good news. Tell me, what is the name of this young man? And I said, it's Ralph. Ralph could not think of the last name. And I remember Leon saying, oh, I knew it was quick, but I thought you'd learn his name.
Oh, it hurts. My chest hurts.
Is that
Well, then she went home and told her parents that she was engaged, and her mom was so worried because she hadn't dated Ralph very long, just a week, maybe?
a day?
A day, okay. She had dated
I'd
a
known him.
day.
I'd known of him for a week.
She'd known him a week, dated a day. And she said, okay, Uncle Ralph says it's been 2 days. But she said, don't worry, Mom. It's okay. We'll have a long engagement. And how long did your engagement last?
3 months.
3 months.
Poor Mom.
Did you hear Marilyn say, poor Mom?
In fact, did any of your family ask your parents for their blessing before you said yes?
I remember when I told Mom and Dad that Arnold proposed. Arnold proposed to me when we hadn't dated. After we were engaged, we decided that we'd call one thing a date because we needed to have a date. But Arnold was very sick. He had pneumonia, and the next morning he was.
With tape it.
Oh yeah, it's taping, and he was going to go in the military the next day, and we had been on a walk, and I saw in the stars it looked like a question mark. And I said, Arnold, I know you've got a lot of questions with your life, and this is a very, from now on you're going to be working on those questions. If you could get an answer tonight, what would your question you'd get answered be? And he said, well, to me, if I could marry you. And so I thought he needed a pen pal at the time. So
You got him a pen pal.
yeah, I thought this is a roundabout way of asking for a pen pal. So, but we decided, I thought, well, that's not my plans, but we had also talked, if anything happened, he was going to the Navy for 4 years, and I was going to college for 4 years, so what was the worry?
Mm-hmm.
We'd worry about that in 4 years. By then, everything would be fine. So I wasn't interested in dating anymore in high school, so that was okay with me, and I went in, and Mom and Dad were in bed, and I said, well, Mom, Arnold asked me to marry him. And Mom said, Marilly, this is so strange. You've never dated. We've never felt like y'all were interested in each other. Did he ever kiss you? And I said, no. And she said, Marilly, I think you've misunderstood.
He didn't know his name.
Can't you hear her kids?
But Arnold was very serious. He had bought a necklace when he was a freshman in college, and he said he was only going to tell one person he loved her. And he went home that night and got that necklace, and he told me he loved me, and then sent it in a letter to Mom and Dad, saying that he knew it was abrupt, and he knew this was going to be a trial period, but of dating by letter, but that he wanted permission, and he would like to consider us engaged. So Mom, yes, I guess you are.
It wasn't a mistake.
Right, yeah.
Oh,
Shirley,
goodness.
Now we
Can you
have
remember-
dads. Do you want to tell your story? How did you, now we know the wedding story, and we've got that typed up, but we don't have the engagement story, Dad.
Okay.
Well, I was quite shy in high school, and so I'd seen Shirley around, but not only was she dating someone else, but I was shy anyway. And so on my senior year at college, I'd come home for Christmas vacation, and we went to the church Christmas program, and Shirley had a class of students, and they performed, and afterwards, they passed to the children the little boxes of candy with a string handle, and Shirley said, "Ken, would you like one?" And I said, "Oh, I've had too much candy already." And I said, "Send it to me in a month." And she didn't say anything, but a month later at the university came a box all wrapped up and a little note saying, "Hi, I bet you thought I'd forget." And then spring vacation came along, and I went up and started to date her. I'm sorry. Wasn't it funny? The first time I was with her, it was as a result of Mother saying, "Ken, would you drive me to Duluth tomorrow shopping?" And I said, "Sure." And I overheard Shirley telling one of her girlfriends that she was going to take the bus to Duluth. And I said, I did get enough courage up to say, "Shirley, would you like to ride with us?" And Shirley said, "Yes." And you remember, Mother made a big day out of shopping. We'd shop till we were tired, then we'd have a lovely cafeteria meal, and then we'd go see a movie, and then we'd go home.
So you did all that?
Yeah, and I remember sitting next to Shirley, and then I think Sally and Hallie and Marilyn
All that?
and Mom were there next in the row. And and it was kind of nice. I reached over and got Shirley's hand, and she let me hold it. And one of the twins saw it, and she looked hard at me, and then she turned to the next twin, and the next twin leaned forward and looked over. And then Marilyn was whispered to. She leaned forward and looked over, and but it was a delightful date that kind of indicated that there was going to be more to come.
Oh. And she put up nicely with all that family stuff.
Yeah.
Love family.
By the way, do you remember when John gave his ring to Jean?
Yeah.
Did you tell that? You guys know this?
John had invited Jean up for Christmas, And Shirley and I had been, married a couple of years.
Yes, because I think they were married in 47 and you were married in 44.
3 years. Anyway, it was fun to see. Joan was there too, wasn't she?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay. Well, the first time she brought both of them. I couldn't tell them apart. But this time, for Christmas, we had gifts for different people, and there was a lot of oohing and awing as we unwrapped the gifts. And Jean kept looking happily on, and finally her gift came. And bless her heart, she opened it with, you could tell, big expectations. And she tried not to show her disappointment when it turned out to be a box of candy with a string handle on it. And and she
Same kind that Mom had given you 2
Yeah.
years earlier?
anyway, after a moment she passed it around, and John kept saying, "Jean, look into the box or something," and she'd look and see a different color of candy, and John kept saying, "Look a little bit deeper," and at the bottom of the box was the engagement ring. But oh, that sure made a difference. And
What's that?
Dad never talked about getting
Is this hard on you, Dad?
not much, a little bit.
Would you like to rest a little bit?
For just a minute while one of you tell.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Shirley, I remember when you came to visit us, when you were living stationed down in El Paso, and you were, I think, thinking about going out of the service, and that's when you hadn't even really considered that you might marry Steve yet, was it?
Oh, I stayed for a long time after that.
What was it? Could you tell us the chronology of that? When you visited us, and Rebecca was just 2, that would have been 75. So tell us,
76. Oh,
tell us what happened then. How did you progress from there?
Okay. There you go, sis. That's about as far as I can go with this, I think.
I guess when I visited you, it was in 76, right after I got out of the military.
You came more than once.
Mm-hmm. Because when I was living in Colorado Springs, I spent Christmas with you.
Yes.
And then when I was in El Paso, y'all came for Thanksgiving.
We all went down and flopped on Shirley.
And then I went to Leonard Wood after El Paso, and then to Hawaii. And in 76, I had been in for 10 years, and it was either stay for 20 or get out, because I didn't want to stay for a couple more years, and I either wanted to go all the way to 20 or do something else. So I got out, and when I left Hawaii, I picked up my car in San Francisco and then went skiing, and then came down and visited you, and then went back up to Wyoming, and then across to Minnesota. And
So that was 76.
mm-hmm. And I thought I'd take about a month's vacation. And poor Mom was so traumatized by my not having a job. So she kept looking in the want ads, I guess. And she saw this job opening. She asked if I wanted to work at Brookwood, and I didn't. And she saw a job opening in Atlanta. So I wrote to Eggleston Children's Hospital, and they sent back, they wanted to interview me. And so I went over for the interview, and Steve was working over there then. And they hired me. So I asked Steve to help me find an apartment. And we looked at a whole bunch of apartments, and I ended up buying one, renting one in the complex where he lived. And it was such a large singles apartment complex. I lived about 2 blocks away from him. And, it was a lovely complex. They had woodworking shops with everything you'd ever want to use, and that was free for the use. They had weight rooms. They had sewing rooms.
Wow.
They had photography studio. They provided everything except the paper. And so it was really neat.
What a nice way to get acquainted in a different
Mhm.
setting than home.
And so I moved in, and we started having dinner together. He'd cook, or I'd cook, or we'd go out. It all depended on how we felt. And that was in April. By December, I had a Christmas tree that year, and had some gifts for him. And I was working Christmas Eve and Christmas night. And Christmas Day, I woke up early. I thought for sure he'd come back then. And he didn't show, and he didn't show, and he didn't show. And so about 8 o'clock, I took down the tree and threw it away and picked up his gifts, and I was going to leave them by his door. And I was ready to leave for work when he knocked on the door. And he asked if I wanted my Christmas gift, and I said no, I had to go to work. So it was the next night I got my ring. I was so mad at him.
Oh, boy.
This is a different story.
This was not nice romantic, no, it wasn't. I was ready to move to Minnesota. I thought if I had 8 months was long enough at my age, and if he wasn't going to propose, I'd move to Minnesota and start over again.
Well, then,
Right again.
what did he give you? Was it a significant thing? Was it something that made you know?
Well, he had a cubic zirconium that he asked, he had it there. He said, would you like to get married? And then we went out and looked for rings. He said, I just gave you this as
You mean
I-
that his Christmas gift was
a ring. Yeah.
Oh, that's neat.
And the timing is so good because the next day she was thinking, was it the next day you were planning on leaving? Or, I mean, you were ready psychologically to move to Minnesota, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but I hadn't done anything about it. I mean, it was just that day I said, well,
The feeling.
this is long enough.
Oh, Shirley, I didn't realize how close you came.
So you see, 8 months is too long.
Well, and I had known him for so long, too,
He was a good friend of
Because-
Ken's.
Okay.
because we had done things in high school
Yeah.
and had dated off and on. I mean, we dated when I came home on leave and stuff. So it wasn't as if it was
You
anything
weren't
new.
starting in
Mm-mm.
that fresh.
I also still laugh at when you were in Hawaii. When you were in Hawaii, and I can't tell the story well, but Steve, I think, was very interested in you and wanted to come visit you in Hawaii. And what happened when he called to come to visit? Do you remember that story?
Oh, you mean he was making reservations?
Yes.
Steve was apprehensive about flying. And so they said, he asked what the route was, and they said, well, it was Dallas-Fort Worth, and then L.A., and then nonstop to Hawaii. He thought there was no way he wanted to stop between L.A. and Hawaii. But being in the military, somebody else wanted leave at that time, and so they canceled my leave and put me on nights. And so I told Steve not to come because there wouldn't be any, I am not very, I don't rest well, and I'm grumpy when I'm on nights. And that wouldn't have been a good time to come visit.
Oh,
So he never came.
well, the story I was thinking of was when he called you and you had been working nights and you answered the phone.
Oh, I am bad when I wake up at night. Well, I do, or don't wake up at night. And he sat up all one Christmas Eve trying to call Hawaii, and the circuits were busy. And he finally got through and said, "May I speak to Shirley?" And I said no and hung up on him. And I never knew he had called. I didn't know for a couple of years he had called.
This was a rocky road.
Christmas Eve is not a good romantic time for them.
Oh, that's funny that you could surmount all that. Oh, and I love to hear about inauspicious beginnings. I think
Yeah.
it's really among the funny.
Well, he was sort of cool for a while, and I wondered what had happened. And it turned out.
So you took 2 years to find that story. Oh, my.
When he was courting her oldest daughter, Sally Beth. Sally knew he was really serious when, after she passed her PhD qualifying examinations, he sent her flowers. He was on a trip to Los Angeles or something. He wired flowers, and she got flowers after she passed her test.
That was so sweet.
Oh,
And so
that
was
is
so
sweet.
he was really
And
that
then
was it.
sealed their fate.
that sealed it.
And then they were engaged for 2 years before they married.
That's Steve never would send flowers. If he sent flowers, I knew something would be wrong. Oh. but Granny, when Grandma was Granny Annie was dying, Mom was up in Minnesota, and Steve's mom was head of a daycare center, and I knew I couldn't go because there was nobody watch the children. And Dad and I,
You know, you couldn't.
I couldn't go because there was nobody watch the children.
Well, how did you? Oh, your children.
My children,
Yeah.
my three.
Yeah.
Brian was 5, and Michael was 2, and Katie was about 8 months.
Tiny.
And Dad and I have been trying to get hold of Marilly and Ken all day, and Steve called me and said, "Well, when do you leave?" And I said, "Steve, I can't leave." And he said, "The children have 2 parents. I'll take vacation and watch them."
Oh.
That's worth
You know.
a whole house full of flowers.
Mm-hmm.
And he did a wonderful job.
You know, I think everybody must have one of those. When I was still 39 and I began to feel a little nauseated when I used a certain kind of lipstick, I thought, oh, this is weird. This only happens when I'm pregnant. I'm sure that can't be. And then I thought, maybe it is. And my first impulse was not joy.
No.
But I made an appointment and went to the doctor, and I still remember when he'd examined me, and then, you know how they offer you their arm so you can sit up. And he said, "Well, I'm pleased to tell you that you're going to have a baby." And I kind of blubbered and said, "Oh, I thought maybe it was a tumor." And he said, "Well, if it's a tumor, it's got arms and legs." And I went home, and I remember that Ralph's brother was visiting, and I was kind of choked up. And he said, "Well, have you thought of an abortion?" And I remember the feeling of hormones, you know, that you get so emotional. And Ralph stepped right in. He said, "Oh, that won't be necessary. We have plenty of love and plenty of money." And I remember the feeling of being so grateful that he had made it clear this was a joyful thing, not a burden. And really everything changed for me then. But that's probably one of the things that made me love Ralph the most. Got one of those?
Thinking of Shirley's story, we were going through the same thing too, because David must have been a year older than Brian, so 6 and 2, and I thought Sean. I guess Sean wasn't. No, Sean was born, I thought. Okay, and okay. Sean wasn't born until 85, so. We went through the same problem, and Arnold said that that he could handle it, and we had next door neighbors that wanted to take care of the boys during the day. And so I remember going up to Minnesota, and this is also, I'm remembering more when Grandma Watkins passed away, and Sean was just a baby.
That was it.
And Arnold was so good about letting me come. And I knew there was going to be so much work for him. And one night I called, and another woman answered the phone. And I asked permission to talk to Arnold, and she asked who I was. I was not a happy person by the time Arnold got to the phone. And I heard the children in the background, and I thought, I thought I was indispensable. I was really irritated. And so he got to the phone, and he was cheerful, and I could tell he was enjoying himself, and there was music in the background, and they were having a party. And he said, well, Marilly, there's a guy at work whose computer is down, and so I made a deal with them that if his wife would come over and watch the kids, we would work on his computer. So we're also playing guitar and having dinner. And he made out really well. The neighbors next door not only took care of the kids at their house, but they came over every day and cleaned our house. And so when I came home, he said, I just don't understand what the big deal is. Our house is always clean when you're not here. Well, I was really aggravated with these neighbors. They didn't have to do that good of a job. And then these other people came over quite frequently because the computer problem took a long time to get fixed. And then you sent him a letter he's got to this day about what a saint he was.
It's all your fault, Marilyn.
Definitely misplaced.
And he totally appreciated it, totally. But he said he got sympathy from everyone in church and food every night, and he said he enjoyed it totally. So, yeah. So I'm glad Shirley had the awesome experience, and I'm glad Arnold was willing to do it too. But I think Arnold enjoyed himself a little bit more than he needed to.
About Mother's trip on the canoe.
Please tell that again.
And you all know different things.
I hadn't heard about it until this year.
This is not.
It's going.
Well, I think the only thing to add to Marily's knowledge, and possibly you already knew this, was that Hallie and Sally and I were looking at Mom's annual, and that brought back some memories. And we all remembered parts of the fact that some way, possibly people started out in a group, I don't know this, but John Stewart was going to take Mom out in the canoe on one of the lakes in Minneapolis. And Dad must have had some knowledge that things were going to be possibly put forward at that time, maybe more serious, and didn't want to give John Stewart any more territory than he needed. So he some way persuaded John, could I take her out first in the canoe? And just think of a friend doing that. So whatever it was, Dad got his 2 cents worth in, and by the time it was John Stewart's turn, Mom was not in a mood to encourage him. And I've always thought,
Encourage John.
John, yeah, right, what are friends for? But it is sweet to think about not only the way the engagement came about, with 2 years of courtship, because Mom tried to persuade Ralph and me to wait that long, and I'd finish nursing and Ralph would finish graduate school, which was no 2 years. And then wouldn't we appreciate that long engagement with letters and a growing acquaintance? And I was so grateful that Dad said, I didn't think much of it. But it is sweet to think that when they did visit back and forth, there was always a chaperone and a group. And I think in some ways people are getting back to, they don't call it a chaperone, but there's a lot more suggestion that you don't pair off until you're fairly sure you are going to marry. And I've heard pros and cons about that too. But it was interesting to me that when we came down for your wedding, the next day your mom planned a nice picnic up at the Arboretum in Birmingham. And I ended up in a car with Sally Beth and Carol Tenney and David Watkins. And I think that was all. Okay. Well, we got talking about these things. Weddings do that. And Dave had never heard of how Mom and Dad were engaged. So he listened very intently, and Carol too. And then what I didn't know was he already knew Patty. I think at the time there was someone named Jane on the horizon, but she evaporated. And later, Patty had to go to a conference up in Duluth, I think. So Dave thought maybe he would drive her up. I think that's the way it went. And Mother was up in Carlton. She was staying with Mrs. Wigg. And David must have told Patty some of these details, because he said, would you like to go out and see the farm? And she said, sure. And he tried to find the Old Spring Road, and of course there was no, the bark had grown over that silver plate. But he said, he started to say, Patty, will you, and I don't think he ever finished the sentence. The way I understood it, she jumped up and down and said, yes, yes, before he got to the end of the question. And then they went and found Mom in town and told her that they had pretty much tried to do it the same way that Grandpa did. And I know that made her happy. So that was a nice rerun. You have to start over again.
Yeah, it's okay.
How Marilly got her name. When we girls were growing up, on Saturday, one thing that sweetened the house cleaning was that we could listen to the radio and pretty well hear it all over our tiny little house. And we had a couple of programs. Earlier it was Let's Pretend. We can all still sing the advertising jingle that went with that. And then Mayor of the Town with Lionel Barrymore and Agnes Moorehead. And Lionel Barrymore was a mayor. He was forgetful and he had a few quirks. And his housekeeper, Agnes Moorehead, was Marilly. And she kept him in line and told him what to do and when to do it. So in the program, over and over again, he would call, "Oh, Marilly," and she'd say, "Coming, coming." And so some way or other, the twins turned my name into Marilly. Well, when I gotten so used to the name, I know Sue, my roommate in college, still calls me that. I forgot that everybody didn't know that. This all happened after the boys had left home. So I would sign my letters sometimes Marilly, and Ken and Shirley thought of it as Marilly, which I think is much prettier.
Oh, me too.
And thought that would make a nice name. And where they came up with Beth was from Shirley's name and her mother and so forth. But Marilly Beth just runs together so beautifully. Now, Marilly also knew a little bit about Lionel Barrymore and maybe Agnes Moorehead. Did you want to say anything about those
Well, the story that I laugh so much about is when I was born, they wrote birth announcements to all the family and said my name was Marilly Beth. And the way Mom tells it, the Watkins family grieved because they thought it was such an ugly name to name a baby Marilly Beth. And so they just felt so sorry for this little baby having such a difficult first name. And they took me up to Minnesota to be baptized. And Mom said it was funny to see people when she'd say my name, and according to everyone else, it was mispronounced. But they thought it was so much better than Marilly.
Brad and Sean and Marilly, the clock that you just wound has been in the family a long time. And Shirley and I got it from Shirley's folks. And I believe they got it from their folks. And we thought it was a very valuable antique, and it might still be a valuable antique. But we were chagrined to look at the back of the clock and see the original Sears sticker on it with, I think it said $5.95. And of course, $5.95 back then was a lot of money. But we were thinking that it would have been quite expensive even back then. So it's quite interesting to see that it's still clicking along all these years with just occasional oiling.
Which grandparent did it originally belong to? Was it the Nyquists or the Blumgrens?
I think it was the Blumgrens. Well,
oh, and did you ever find out how much it really is worth?
no, we were a little bit dismayed to find out that while it's old, Sears made so many of them that they're not all that valuable.
Except to us.
Except to us.